There's a good chance that at some point you'll need to store sensitive information in a configuration file. One common example is to store the username and password in a connection string required to connect to a database. IIS and ASP.NET make it very difficult for a casual user to read .config files. But users who have read access on the server may be able to read the information. The good news is that it's very easy to encrypt a section of a configuration file programmatically using the protected configuration features in ASP.NET. The protected configuration provider class in the system.configuration namespace is the base class for all protected configuration providers. You can use a protected configuration provider for encrypting and decrypting sections of a web.config file, such as the connection string section. You should consider encrypting any sections in a configuration file that contain sensitive information, rather than storing it in clear text. The nice thing is that once you protect a section with encryption, you don't need to decrypt it before it can be read. ASP.NET takes care of that automatically. You just read the value as normal using the normal configuration file techniques, and ASP.NET takes care of decrypting the data. The .NET Framework includes two protected configuration providers that you can use to encrypt sections of a configuration file. The first is the DeepAPI Protected Configuration Provider, and this uses the Windows Data Protection API, or DeepAPI, to encrypt and decrypt configuration sections. This provider uses a machine-specific key that can be used only for configuration files located on the same computer. This is useful for anonymous servers, but provides less scalability than the RSA Protected Configuration Provider. All right, so that's the second provider, is that RSA Protected Configuration Provider. It uses the RSA Crypto Service Provider, which is a feature of the .NET Framework, in order to encrypt and decrypt configuration settings. It uses RSA public key encryption, which is required for encrypting and decrypting configuration files that will be used on multiple computers. So this is the provider to use if you're going to need to move your web application to another machine. And both of these providers are registered in the config protected data section of the machine.config file. Here I am in Windows Explorer, and I'm at the local disk Windows Microsoft.NET Framework 64, version 4.0 of the framework, the config folder. And that's where you can find machine.config in most versions of Windows. So I'll right-click on this and open it up with Notepad. And as you can see, it's a huge file with lots of settings that apply to all .NET applications that execute on this machine. So the section that I'm interested in is config protected data. Okay, there's that section. So there's where those two providers are defined. So here's the RSA Protected Configuration Provider, and you can see the object that actually implements it, the RSA Protected Configuration Provider, same name, and then the DeepAPI Configuration Provider, which is named here the Data Protection Configuration Provider. But as you can see, that uses a DeepAPI Protected Configuration Provider. So that's the object within the .NET Framework, and specifically within the system.configuration namespace that implements that provider. And so the important thing here is knowing where this is defined. If you want to add any, you can add it to machine.config here. But these are the names that you use within your application. So use Data Protection Configuration Provider instead of the DeepAPI Protected Configuration Provider. Okay, so let's see how you can put those to use. Now, the connection string section is a good candidate for encryption because it often contains sensitive information, things like a username and password for a database. And an attacker could use that to mount an attack on your server. Now, although no one can browse to the web.config file, anyone who has read permissions on the file share can simply open the file with a text editor. So let's take a look at how easy it is to encrypt connection strings. So first, I'll open up web.config. And notice that I have 3 connection strings here. So these are just various databases. I have the connection to the local DB. This is created with a typical project. And then I have a connection to a local instance of the Northwind database. If I scroll over, you can see it connects to Northwind. And then I also have a connection to a Microsoft Access database. Okay. The application doesn't actually use any of these databases, but these are connection strings within the connection string section. It's very common if your application has to access multiple relational databases to have multiple connection strings, or in fact, almost any kind of database. Okay, but the main thing here is that you can see that this section is currently in clear text. I don't happen to have any username and passwords here. I'm using integrated security for everything. But if I did, it would be in clear text within the web.config. Okay, so now I'll show you the sample application. I'll go ahead and start it up in Internet Explorer. Okay, I'll click on the Encrypt Configuration sections, and that goes to this Config Encryption view and action method. And this does 2 things. First thing it does is it retrieves the connection strings. So I'll go ahead and click on that. And that gives this nice interface into all of the connection strings. So notice that I get a local SQL server. This is actually coming from machine.config. And then I have the 3 that are defined within this project. So these are all the connection strings that are accessible through the hierarchy of config files that are available to this ASP.NET MVC application. Okay, then the next thing I can do is I can toggle encryption. Click on that, and it tells me now that is protected as true. And I can go back over the project, and Visual Studio helpfully tells me that web.config changed. And I have the option of reloading it. In this case, only one file changed. If multiple files changed, I could load them all, or opt not to. So I'll go ahead and reload that. And notice that we have a different connection string section here. We have a new attribute called Config Protection Provider that identifies what provider was used in order to encrypt this data. And it was the DeepAppy configuration provider. And then instead of the strings themselves, I have this encrypted data, cipher value, and this long encrypted string that contains all of those connection strings, now very securely encrypted. Okay, so let me stop the application, and let's take a look at the code for this. So I'll go into the home controller. And here's the code for the initial view. So it's config encryption. There's no message. I just clear it each time that I load the page, and I return the view. And we can take a look at the view. As you can see, this is fairly simple. It has a couple of links that kick off those action methods, a place to display the message, and then this unordered list that displays all of the connection strings. So just if the model is not equal to null, it just loops through each setting within the model. And the model that I'm using here is a system.configuration.connectionString section collection. So this is a collection of all of the connection strings that are available to the application. So I just loop through those, create a line item for each of those, and output the data, just reading the different name, provider name, and connection string properties of each item within that collection. Okay, so the view is fairly straightforward, but it does use a model that's provided by the controller. Okay, so here's the first action method that does something on the page. This is the code that toggles the encryption for the connection string section. So the first thing it does is it opens up the web configuration file. So this is going to get a reference to web.config. And then it gets a reference to the connection strings settings. So all of these features that I've used so far are just part of the built-in .NET Framework configuration support. So there's very rich methods for getting access to the .config files. And then it checks to see if the section is protected. This is really nice, so you don't have to read any data in there and have some sort of algorithm to figure out if the data is already protected or not. There's a property that gives you that information. And then all I need to do to protect it is, in this case, execute the protect section method and specify the configuration provider that I want to use to protect that data. And so this is why it was protected using the data protection configuration provider as that attribute on the connection strings element specified. Otherwise, if it is already protected, all I have to do is just unprotect the section. It knows from the information within the web.config which provider was used, and it takes care of unprotecting it. And then once I'm done making changes to it, I have to save that file. That's what actually persists it back out to the file system. And then I create a viewBag message and specify whether or not it was protected. And I just return the value of that is protected. So just keep in mind that the value here is going to be different than what it was here, because by unprotecting it or protecting it, it's going to toggle that value. Okay, then the second method is the retrieve connection strings. And this is just very simple code here. So I once again have to get a reference to the connection strings section of the web.config. And that's really easy. I just use the web configuration manager, and it gives me that reference to that. And that's where it creates that connection string settings collection that I just went ahead and used as the model for that view. So as long as the settings are not null, I can just return the view called config encryption. So I'm sharing this view with both of these methods, and then passing settings as the model. So the nice thing about the view is you have a lot of options about specifying a different view, because by default, it's going to look for a view called retrieve connection strings, but it's going to use config encryption instead. Okay, and if settings is null, then it couldn't find any connection strings. And so it just returns the config encryption, but with a null model. And none of the connection strings are then displayed. That's all the code that's required to perform these actions. So I'm going to run the application again. And go to that option. Notice that even though web.config is encrypted, in fact, I can go back over here, look at web.config, it's still encrypted. I can still retrieve the connection strings. The code doesn't have to change just because that data is encrypted. Because ASP.NET, actually the .NET Framework, takes care of decrypting the data for me and makes it available for use. And then I can also toggle encryption again, and now is protected as false. If I go back over here, once again tells me it's changed, and I have my original data back. It's not formatted quite as prettily as I had before, but all the data is there, it's valid data, it's now available in clear text. Now, one really nice thing about all this is that you can also encrypt external configuration files. So this is the situation where rather than including connection strings here within web.config, I can put it in a connections.config file. If I go over here to Solution Explorer, you can see that I have that file already created. But it's really easy to create. I can just add an item and a configuration file. That's one of the templates that are available within ASP.NET applications, or in fact many .NET applications. And so double-click on that, and that has that connection strings setting. So what I'm going to do is come back over here, and I'm going to comment out this section. And uncomment this item here. So all I've done is I've taken this connection strings section and put it in this connections config file. and then set the config source so it knows where to find it. So I'll save my changes, run the application again. I can retrieve the connection strings. It goes out and gets them from the external file. And I can toggle encryption. So it's now protected. Come back over here. It says web.config is changed and connections.config is changed. So nothing's really changed in web.config. I suspect it's just overwriting it and saving it. But if I come here now, this is all encrypted data, just like before. So it transparently handled the situation where you're using external configuration files. Not something you have to do often, but if you have a complex configuration file, app.config or web.config, you can break out parts of it out into external files, which makes it much easier to replace settings. You just have to overwrite this entire file if you wanted to include entirely different connection strings. You just have to be careful. If they're encrypted, you have to already pre-encrypt that data. Okay, go back over my application, toggle the encryption one more time. Takes a moment. Now it's false. Come back over here, reload, and I have my clear text connection strings retrieved.